When you're constructing stuff, your pockets, you can put piping in the seams. Any seams can have piping added into it. We use the bias binding, so you can make your own bias binding. It just means that your fabric is cut on the 45-degree grain. So on these pieces, the straight grain goes down this way and across this way, and I've cut it at that 45-degree angle. I tend to cut mine about 3.5–4 centimetres, and that seems to be enough when I insert my piping to allow for the 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. To join bias strips, it's a bit confusing sometimes, so if you just lay them both at a right angle, because when you cut them you get all these funny little angles, so if you lay them on top of each other, just check that when you then sew the seam you'll make a continual bit. That's always a key thing to do. And then you join them by sewing down across that angle, so you're actually sewing it on the straight grain. Don't mess up your threads like that. So you're actually sewing this on the straight grain, so it's not going to stretch as you're sewing and joining those pieces, but it gives you what it does is it gives you a cross seam, so it's less bulky. So once you've sewn them, check which side you've done it and just trim them down to 1/4 inch or 7 millimetres, and then you've got your continual bit, and you just make a big long piece of bias tape. Press that open on the iron. So that's how you make your bias tape. Before, if you're going to fold it, when you buy bias tape like that, even though it's got 2 folded edges, that would be bought as folded, and the measurement is across here, so that will come out at 1.5 centimetre folded. That's when you buy bias tape, how they do it. You can do that easily on the ironing board by putting some pins in. Press them first of all, put pins across it, and then as you pull those between the 2 pins, you can continually iron it. Right, you just keep it loose on the pins. Another little tip. So just trim those bits off. So that's how to make bias binding, which is another useful thing anyway to add an accent. But if we're going to make it as piping, you need a zip foot. Just a normal standard zip foot, because that enables you to get nice and close, because it just works that the ridge on the zip foot allows the piping to sit beside it, and you're joining them together. So pop your zip foot on, standard zip foot. Remember, if you've got this type of one, to move the needle. So make sure you go in, you've got your, that's the inside, so you're going to insert your piping cord into the middle. So if you've got seams, make sure they're on the inside. And you just attach it with the cord and lay it in the middle. You're not actually stitching the cord, you're just going to create a piece of piping, corded piping. You can make piping without the cord. So that's another nice little way of adding accent, and in that instance you just use the bias tape and place it in, sew it in before the seam in the same way, but you don't have the actual piping cord inserted into your binding. But for this demo I'm just showing you adding it in and making your own piping. So as we do, we just sew it all and just lay that in the middle, line your raw edges up, and the zip foot, you can see, enables you to get nice and close. If you're not close enough and you've got the ability, you can nudge your needle over a bit. In clothes we tend to use quite excuse me, a narrow piping cord, about 3 millimetres. If you're not right up close in this instance, it doesn't matter because you're just constructing the piping cord, but you can see you're sewing that, and that gives you that nice piping cord. And then you continue making more than the amount you think you need, is what I suggest, because for some reason when you work with bias tape it always uses more than you think. I think it's the way it stretches when it sews. Just show you that coming over the seam and how that wraps, so it's not bulky even if you use the joined pieces. Even the stuff you buy is joined. It's also a good scrap buster for adding and using up scraps. So that is your piping that you can buy. You can buy it like that, but that's making your own for using your own fabrics. Popping it into a seam, you could, going back to the beauty of this way of constructing the pocket in the seam, you could have put piping in there as well, and then that would be nicely on the edge. So that's really good, having that seam right on the edge there, and you can insert the seam, but I'll just put it in a little bit at the end next to it, just show you it going into a seam. Any seam that you've got, you can add it. So when you add this in, you will lay it. Alright, so it's lined up, the raw edges, and you're sewing your 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. Now you do not want that showing. Alright, so if you're starting at the top or something like that, and you're starting it here, what you want to do is pull that bit of piping cord out and trim it down. Keep hold of it further down, because otherwise you just end up pulling it all the way out. So make sure you've gripped it further down. Trim that back by the seam allowance amount, and then pull the fabric back again. And then you're just, first of all, got just the fabric. So when you're then, later on I'll show you turning that under, it's not got the piping cord. So it's not too bulky. Excuse me. So just remember to keep it all lined up as if you're sewing it. So when you're joining it in, you're lining it all up, and that is your 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. So if your piping cord isn't quite lined up, you need to make sure that that isn't your 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. If it's not 1.5 finished, a bit smaller, line that up. Okay. So sew your seam just like normal, as if there wasn't that piece of piping cord there. Obviously, take time, take care, and the zipper allows it to go along the piping cord, lays right up, so you can see there how close that's getting to the piping cord. If you've got a join, you would stop and then start again, and then go back and join them together. Joining the 2 bits of bias tape, as I showed you at the beginning, and then laying them over. But another way of doing it is bending it off. If you want your piping to just disappear in the middle of a seam, so you just want some flashes, or you want it to finish before the hem, I wouldn't pre-cut it. I would always do it when I get near the end, because otherwise you end up like running short. So again, I've just trimmed that down, but this time I've trimmed it, and I'm going to bend that, and I've trimmed it so that that's at the 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. So as I start sewing towards it here, I'm bending that into the seam, and then continuing it. Now I could have done that, I could have started in the same manner, I can start and finish in the same manner to cross them over. So you can add a few like different types going in. I'll just show you quickly, starting it exactly the same way. But if you wanted like if you wanted to join it in a rather than opening it all out and you found that a bit faffy, you can just cross them over. So trim that one down. If I want to join them in this way, trim the one I'm going to start with. And get different widths of piping cords as well. And then in this instance, what I can do is start and finish with that little crossover. if I wanted to. Keep sewing it. And then you're piping in the seam there. So that's one way of sort of starting and joining it. If you crossed it over a little bit more, you can just start and stop it. What this will allow is if you've got a fold or a pleat or something like that, it just allows less bulk. All right, if you've got a hem at the bottom, I had that flat, so that will allow you to sew through it. That'd be no cord in there. It's too bulky if the cord's in there. And again, at this end, if I'd continued sewing that and cut it back, then when you haven't got that in, if that's your hem there, that will enable you to have a nice, neat finish and hem your garment. And it just looks rather nice accent into any seam that you've got.